This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hello and welcome to the Storyworks Roundtable. Today, Catherine, Robert, and I are answering a listener's question. Marina wanted to know our take on writing a character outside of your cultural background. So she's got a story with two characters from different worlds. She's using research and empathy, and she says, if done from a place of love and respect, is that okay to do? Now, this question actually came through on Facebook, so I answered, so I didn't have to leave her hanging till we got this episode recorded. I said, we'll definitely tackle that in brief. I have to write who I do not know. Or my stories would all be boring as heck. The role of the writer is to imagine herself into existence of not only another person, but another way of being, which includes otherness in the form of culture, class, race, historical era, even species, etc. All fiction is speculative in that way. In our current social climate, it can be tricky and even feel dangerous to write a character who's not like you in certain key ways. But if that's what you're compelled to write it, give it your best. And when possible, get someone who knows that identity to answer your questions about authenticity and verisimilitude. You know, I think if you can write a medieval knight or a space pirate, why can't you write someone who's contemporary but different from yourself? So that was my kind of nutshell take on that question. How would you two answer this question of writing otherness?
How would I answer that political hot potato? Carefully.
Well, okay, why is it a political hot
I don't know.
potato?
Well, because we live in a society that's become edgy about everything. Mm-hmm. And, you know, would a big five or big four publisher publish Lolita these days? No, I don't think it would see the light of day. So I think it's tricky because, as you say, you know, it's all speculative at the end of the day. Mm-hmm. And, you know, if all we wrote was a journalistic type account of our own lives, that it would be deadly boring. So, right. So in a way, you're always writing otherness. And mm-hmm. I think because of sensitivity towards minorities these days, there's a lot more judgment perhaps about it than there mm-hmm. needs to be. And I think I like what you said was, you know, push judgment out the window, and also what Marina has said, you know, coming from a place of respect obviously helps. Mm-hmm. But I personally wouldn't avoid it because I just think it's, you know, it's part of what makes stories interesting are the clashes and differences, and, you know, the heart of a story is conflict. Mm-hmm. And how can you have conflict if everybody is the same? So right. in a way, you know, you're kind of starting from a point, as you say, of otherness anyway. Mm-hmm. So I think it's more that socially we're being more careful. And mm-hmm. so, as you said, you could employ readers. You know, some people very specifically ask for, say, you know, could a person of color please just check this character, you know, or could someone with an Arabic background please confirm this would be the case? Mm-hmm. And that's wise. I mean, that's only like going to a legal counsel and saying, you know, can you check that I got this point of law that was a plot point in the court correct? Right. It's not really any different, I don't think.
No, I agree with that. I think we as writers need to do due diligence. We need to, come from the place of respect and empathy and, you know, love and concern for our characters in the story we're telling. And then B, we need to do our homework and get the facts right, the, you know, lived experience of beingness we can only imagine through our empathy and our storytelling ability. But there's a lot of information that goes into that character building process. And so that's where the due diligence comes in, you know, making sure that we have our facts right about that particular place or culture or time frame or, you know, whatever the issue happens to be.
And there's quite a lot of sensitivity as well about things like, in thrillers and such, violence towards women, because of the whole, and rightly so, Me Too movement. So that you're seeing a lot more trigger warnings as well, if those sort of characterizations are veering towards things that are very extreme. But I don't think that's what Marina's talking about. I think Marina's talking about, look, I want to write about someone who lives in Spain, who's a devout Catholic, and I'm not. Is that okay?
Right.
And how do I do that? And the answer would be the same way you would research anything in your book, whether it be a setting or a plot point. So I don't really see any reason to fear it, but I can understand why in today's climate a newbie writer might feel odd about that. But there are plenty of works of fiction where they might be set in a time where, in the 60s, when, for example, people of color were heavily oppressed in the US. So, if you're writing and your male protagonist is white, coming from a point of privilege, then I've seen writers attacked because how dare you, take this attitude towards people of color. Well, it's the freaking character, dude. It's not me. And so I think it's a shame it's a hot potato for that reason. But at the end of the day, we write because we care about a story that's coming from somewhere in our heads. And, I think if you're doing that justice, and look, it may be controversial. Whatever, if you're writing a controversial character, then just be aware that that's how your audience are going to receive it. But
I think that this question, to me, it's just the question of, should I be a writer? Because I feel like what you're asking is, should I write stuff? Because, and not to oversimplify it, but that's kind of what you're doing as a writer. You are saying something, you're making a statement, you're making up, you're becoming something other. So I feel like this question in its simplest terms is, should I write stuff? And the answer to me is always absolutely yes, do it. And then, if something comes up or if something's wrong, fix it, and that's the way that I always try to approach it.
Right. I think Catherine Stockett's book, The Help, is a really great example of this, because she is a white woman. I don't really know where she grew up or what her ethnic background is beyond Caucasian, or, where she was educated or anything. But many of her characters are African American, and that book was a huge success that became a hugely successful movie. And some people wondered, well, can we accept this work as it is for the work itself when it's not written by an African American woman? And if you do your job well as a writer and you love and respect your characters, the answer is yes. Look at the success of that book and the film. And, it's also a good example of that kind of due diligence versus empathy. Those two, or not versus, but those two layers of storycraft that we need to engage with. Because being a historical piece, there's what were the houses like? What were women's roles as homemakers like? What was the fashion of the time? How did these African American women who were the help get to their employers' homes? What were they up at 4 a.m. to catch a bus at 4:30? What was kind of the average household life, their existence like? So that's where the factual digging comes in. But then there's the human piece of it. What does it feel like to be this person versus that person? And she had to look at both sides of the equation, the employees and the employers, so to speak, and cross that racial divide and tell an engaging story with empathetic human characters, for readers of all races, all classes, moviegoers, for everybody. So that's our job as writers.
Yeah, I suppose, it's very easy to speak, isn't it, when you're coming from a position of privilege. Here we are, 3 white middle-class people, and the history is that we've appropriated everything, so including, every genre of fiction. So maybe, it's a hot potato because of that reason alone. That we can say, oh yeah, write it whatever you like, but maybe people who come from minorities say, well, no, because that's what spoiled it in the past, and that's where the backlash comes from. But I am with you on that. I think you've, as what Catherine says, you're writing for a reason. You've got something to say. Just be aware that whatever you do there really is going to be in the public eye if you're publishing.
Right.
The root word is publishing, it's making it publicly available. So I think we come back to Marina's point, if I'm doing it with love and respect and and you're carefully researching like anything else, then, like your example with The Help, why can't that be successful? So, yeah, I mean, presumably people who are in other cultures have written, white protagonists perfectly well. So,
right. And, where do you put the line if you're going to draw a line at all? Like, can women not write male characters? Can men not write female characters? Can young people not write older characters? We're always writing outside of our experience, outside of our realm of personal knowledge. And it's that placing ourselves as the writer in a position of deep empathy with the character we're creating, that's what makes a work of fiction stand out.
Yeah, exactly. You got to separate the craft from the can of worms, and accept that whatever epoch we're writing in, there's always going to be something that may jar with what we're writing. So make it a great work of fiction, and no one will care.
Right.
Yeah. Exactly. I like that line, separate the craft from the can of worms. We have a new tagline.
There you go. Yeah. Well, and I think you have to realize too that, as the writer, you're putting your own person and ness and empathy and compassion into it. The reader's going to have their own set that they're bringing into it as well. So you just have to control what you can control and then let it be. and that's okay, sometimes to just let it be at that point and let the other people handle it how they're going to have to handle it themselves. So
yes. Well, and if someone was reading a work without knowing anything about the author, then it wouldn't matter. It's like if you went and saw the film The Help and didn't look up who the author is or know anything about her, then you might just enjoy it for what it is. I watched August Osage County the other night, and it was written by Tracy Letts. And Tracy, woman, right? It's got all these female characters. It's a family drama. It's a play that was adapted into a movie while staying very true to the play. So carried by dialogue, these characters, the setting is tiny. It's great. And Tracy, it's a woman. And then I was watching the extras on the DVD, and there was an interview with Tracy Letts about doing the adaptation to the screenplay. Tracy's a man. And I was like, oh, wow. Okay, good job, Tracy. I had to step back from my preconceived notions, from my expectations based on how much these characters and the storyline resonated with me, especially as a woman, and say, okay, now if it had been written by like John Letts or Bill Letts, that wouldn't have been an issue. But because I saw the name Tracy, I had this image in my head of who the author was, and it colored my expectations and understanding of this piece of art. And I had to change that. So if everyone could consume the art without that lens, without those expectations and preconceived notions about the artist, you would have a cleaner, purer relationship to the art. Because that problem only occurs when you go, wait, that person wrote this story. Am I okay with that?
So here's an interesting thought about that then. let's say that the film didn't impress and that you thought it was too cliched in the view of women. Mm-hmm. And you wondered, I wonder where this Tracy woman's got these ideas from. And then you found it was written by a man. I mean, obviously it's completely hypothetical, but I wonder if that would colour our judgment. Because I'm thinking, as you were talking, I'm thinking, I suppose where these sort of recent debates are coming from maybe are based around stereotypes. Because, I remember, growing up in the UK where almost every single, UK thriller had the bad guy with a German accent or a South African accent. Mm-hmm. And, obviously recent experience at that point of, finishing World War II, the threat of, the evil Hitler. I mean, the Germans have had to live with that stigma, including their accent being used in movies to depict a bad guy. And I think maybe what we're evolving to now in society is a more broader understanding that just because someone looks different or has an accent or comes from a different religious background doesn't mean that they have all these behaviours that we have previously associated with that, because they may just be prejudices that we grew up with. And I think that's what gets thrown at the white middle class label. So if you're going to the effort of saying, well, I want to write an Orthodox Jew into my story, and of course, they never do anything on Saturdays and they wear all these funny things and, I'm going to make them really critical of everything. Well, okay, so that might be your face value of what you've seen, but is that really true? So again, we come back to, well, let's do the research. If you were writing a setting, you'd research it thoroughly. So if you really want to write that kind of character, don't take at face value, if you have never lived that life, what you think it might be, because you might just end up writing stereotypes. And if you look at the great works of fiction like The Help or the movie you were talking about, clearly what they didn't do was portray stereotypical characters.
Right, exactly. There is deep empathy for those characters, and it comes through. And also depth is, all of those characters have apparent depth to them. So we as readers or viewers can empathize with them on multiple levels through our experience of engaging with that piece of art. And that's what writing any good character is about, whether that character is very close to home or,
Right, exactly.
the complete opposite. And if I can write somebody medieval or somebody futuristic, or, why can't I also write somebody of a different culture or background than myself? You're still doing research. You're still looking at, the knowledge base that establishes that character's world, and then you put a human being on the page.
Yes. And that's the key. It's to put the human being on the page. Don't put a character, not a caricature. Get away from the cliche, get away from the stereotypes. And if you have a round, well-developed character with flaws and motivation and goals and dreams and problems and conflicts and relationships, then then you're on the right track.
Right. Yeah. And their flaws may, on the surface of it, look like a stereotype because it's what we know about those sort of specific, say, cultures or people. They may even, that character might wear their prejudices on their sleeve. So it's really interesting because, again, as the author, you get labelled. You're definitely at risk of being labelled with those prejudices when all you've written is a character. So I think it's a curious thing. It's, at the end of the day, it's art, isn't it? Some people are going to think art is, that piece of art is rubbish, and some people think it's brilliant. So that's, as you say, Catherine, that's, at the end of the day, you're writing and
right. It's a subjective art.
Yeah.
And you're going to have to deal with the problems that come with a subjective art. You can't just automatically label it good or bad. It's going to depend on who's consuming it.
True. And I think, so I do just want to acknowledge one thing about kind of the white middle class status versus any other status in our Western cultures is there is that element of writing what that informs everything we create. And so if you grow up in the majority culture in America, say, but I assume this applies to England and Australia and, the rest of Europe and Britain as well, then what is majority mainstream culture, and it is by and large a white middle class culture. That's, the commercialism, the consumerism, it's marketing to white middle class culture. So that's what we are constantly just steeped in as people. Whereas if you are in any one of the subcultures, any minority culture, whether it's based on your religion or your race or your class or whatever, your subculture, your people, how you were raised, your worldview, your linguistic differences. So that is yours. You get to own it and know it, but you also get to know the larger culture because you're steeped in it the same as us. So those of us who are white middle class people, we don't necessarily have access to non-majority cultures. So then we have to rely more on research or getting feedback from, close friends of those other groups and such. And I think that's where the trickiness lies and why it can feel dangerous, because, I'm not just imagining something out there. I'm trying to write something where I can be called on it. Mm-hmm. People can go, no, you got it wrong.
Right.
Yeah. But it for me, it really comes down to that issue of we're limited by our status of only being part of the majority culture. As artists, that's a limitation. I'm not talking about social privilege and all the other conversations that can be had around that. I'm just talking about as artists. Mm-hmm. Right? So if you want to write that character who is not like you, you've got to do more digging and apply more of your skills and talents as a writer to create that whole being.
Absolutely.
Art.
Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.